What if I told you that one of the greatest civil rights victories in history was built on decades of losses? What if the lawyers who changed the course of American history knew they would lose and still chose to fight anyway? Today, we're uncovering the hidden strategy behind the legal battle that led to Brown versus Board of Education and why those early defeats were actually the foundation of victory. Long before the Supreme Court declared school segregation unconstitutional in 1954, Black lawyers were already fighting in courtrooms across the United States, and for years they were losing. But these losses were not because they lacked skill, intelligence, or vision. They were part of a deliberate, long-term strategy. These attorneys understood something powerful. Sometimes you don't fight to win today. Sometimes you fight to change the future. Civil rights victories didn't suddenly appear in the 1950s. They were built step by step through difficult cases, hostile judges, and legal systems that were designed to reject them. For Black attorneys in the early 20th century, the courtroom was more than a place to win justice. It was a place to build a record, expose injustice, and force the country to confront its own contradictions. To understand this strategy, we have to go back to 1896. In Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation was constitutional under the idea of separate but equal. This decision gave legal support to Jim Crow laws across the nation. It told the country that segregation was acceptable, as long as facilities for Black and white Americans were supposedly equal. But in reality, those facilities were never equal. Schools, transportation, housing, and public services for Black Americans were systematically underfunded and neglected. The courts knew this. The public knew this. Yet the law still protected the system. At that point, many people believed the courts were a dead end. But instead of giving up, Black lawyers adapted. They changed their approach. Instead of attacking segregation directly, they began to challenge its inequalities. Organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund developed a long-term plan. Their goal wasn't immediate victory. Their goal was pressure. They wanted to force the legal system to confront the truth that separate but equal was a myth. This strategy was shaped by one of the most influential legal minds of the era, Charles Hamilton Houston, the former dean of Howard University School of Law. Houston believed lawyers had a responsibility beyond personal success. He famously told his students that they could either be social engineers or parasites on society. He trained a generation of attorneys to use the Constitution as a tool for structural change. One of his most famous students was Thurgood Marshall, who would later become the first Black justice on the Supreme Court. But before that historic moment, Marshall and others were part of a much longer fight. One of the earliest battles focused on education. Instead of trying to end segregation immediately, these lawyers targeted the inequalities within the system. They asked courts to examine the differences in funding, facilities, and opportunities. In Missouri, ex rel Gaines v. Canada, the Supreme Court ruled that Missouri could not deny a Black student admission to its law school unless it provided an equal alternative within the state. This decision was narrow, but it created pressure. If states wanted to maintain segregation, they now had to spend huge amounts of money creating equal institutions. Many simply could not. That pressure continued with Sweat v. Painter and McLaurin v. Oklahoma State Regents. In these cases, the court began to recognize something new, that segregation created intangible inequalities. Even if buildings and books were similar, the experience of isolation and exclusion caused real harm. These rulings did not overturn Plessy, but they weakened it. Each case added evidence to a growing legal record. Each loss, each narrow win, and each judicial opinion exposed the contradictions in American law. So when Brown versus Board of Education reached the Supreme Court, it was not a single case. It was the result of years of preparation. It brought together lawsuits from multiple states. The legal teams relied heavily on the work of earlier generations who had fought and often lost. In 1954, the court finally ruled that segregated public schools were inherently unequal. This was a historic turning point, but even then, change did not happen overnight. In the follow-up decision, the court ordered desegregation with all deliberate speed. That phrase allowed many states to delay integration for years, sometimes decades. This reveals a deeper truth about the legal system. Courts are not completely neutral. They reflect power, politics, and the times in which they operate. The civil rights lawyers understood this. They did not see the courts as perfect. They saw them as tools, sometimes obstacles, sometimes weapons. They filed cases they expected to lose. They appealed decisions they knew would be upheld. They forced judges to write opinions that would one day become evidence. They understood that every argument, every dissent, and every footnote could shape the future. And the lessons from that era still matter today. Modern legal battles over voting rights, equal protection, and education shows that progress is not permanent. Decisions like Shelby County versus Holder and Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard demonstrates how quickly decades of legal progress can be narrowed or reversed. The record built by earlier generations reminds us that justice is not guaranteed. It must be defended again and again. Many of the lawyers who laid the groundwork for civil rights never saw the victories they helped create. Some risked their careers, their safety, and even their lives. Others were forgotten, their names overshadowed by the landmark cases that came later. But their legacy lives on in constitutional law, legal precedent, and the rights millions of people enjoy today. Their work teaches us that change is often slow. It is difficult. And sometimes, the most powerful victories begin with losses. So the next time you hear about a court case that seems small or unsuccessful, remember this story. That loss might be the first step towards something bigger. If you found this story powerful, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more deep dives into history, law, and the stories that shaped our world. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.